Good morning, everybody. Really happy to be able to moderate this panel today. My name is Jim Kellner. I'm an associate professor here in IBIS, and I have a background in the field of remote sensing, so satellite imaging, and carbon mapping, a problem I've been working on for about 15 years, using a variety of spaceborne and airborne type of imaging and other technology. We're going to get into the problem of nature-based carbon credits today. I want to build on some of the fundamental tensions that exist surrounding the idea and the topic of what nature-based credits are. What we're going to do here is first we'll ask the panelists to each introduce themselves. We'll just go right down the list. Then I'm going to provide a brief overview of what I see some of the fundamental tensions to be, and then we'll get into the details and see how far we can get. So I'll start right here. David Schurman, would you like to please introduce yourself?
Hello. All right, this is on. Hi, I'm David Schurman. I am class of 2020, actually, from Brown. So what that practically means is I didn't know how to walk when carbon offsets were invented, but also I'm part of the generation that is going to have to play a big role in fixing this. So excited to be up here right now. I'm the co-founder and chief technology officer of a company called Perennial, and what we do is we monitor the greenhouse gas impacts of agriculture. For those of you who haven't heard of agriculture, it's this new thing where you can plant things in the ground to grow food. No, seriously. It's actually a very, very large potential lever on climate mitigation, and also it's right now a huge source of emissions. In terms of my background, I got started in climate around 10 years ago, growing up in Colorado, which is kind of this big center for atmospheric research. And I was working in a lab at NOAA, and I was the intern who would go and take the atmosphere samples from the collection site back to the lab to get analyzed. And that was right when the sensors started to read about 400 ppm and cross that threshold. That's parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was a big foreboding. It was what inspired me to kind of focus on this problem. And I was always in search of big solutions. What is something that is not a drop in the bucket compared to the tens of gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents that we're emitting every year? And what I first started looking at was a set of approaches called solar geoengineering. Essentially what you have to know is those are large-scale ideas for how to hack the planet to cool it off really quickly. Found pretty quickly that was not going to be a very good idea if we can help it because of the large consequences. And started looking at a lot more ways of addressing the problem, again at large scale, and got extremely discouraged because it seemed like either you had to pick between something that's big and has a bunch of unintended consequences, or from a theoretical capacity can only scale to be a drop in the bucket compared to what we actually need to reverse or stop emitting. And that kind of led me to soil and agriculture. And I'll talk about it more certainly later on in the panel, but it is, if we can get it right, soil and agriculture is one of those things that could be a happy medium between. It is huge in terms of impact, and it's fast, but it also doesn't have a bunch of unintended consequences in the environment. In fact, it is reversing to a state that came before. So I will stop now. Long intro.
Thank you, David. Next is Dr. Carolina Lisboa.
Hi. It's working? Yes. First of all, I want to thank you, Jim, and all the organizers for the invitation to be here. My name is Carolina Lisboa. I work for Verra. I'm quite sure all of you have heard about our company. We build standards and for develop methodologies that can monitor and report and verify the credits, that the carbon credits being removed or the emissions which are being reduced. I'm very proud to be here today in many ways for bringing a voice from the Global South because I'm Brazilian, and also for bringing also a different perspective here because I don't have a financial background or economic. I'm an agronomist, and I have practical experience in the field. And I also came from the scientific background. I have a PhD in soil science. I have been studying soil fertility and food production for many, many years. And also, I came from a farming family in Brazil. We are a dairy family. So I really have this practical side of this whole carbon market history and how we can play a role there helping fighting climate change. I think that's it for me. I just want to say a final word. I'm really very humbled to be here and honored to be in front of our co-founder here, David, which is always been inspiring to us. And I'm really happy to meet you in person finally. And I want to thank you for having started this whole company and building everything that we are leveraging for you now. Thank you.
And our next panelist is Dr. Spencer Meyer.
That was a really nice tribute, by the way. Nice touch. Good morning, everyone. I'm Spencer Meyer. I'm the Vice President of Ratings at a company called BeZero Carbon. We're a global ratings agency. You can think of us as an S&P or Moody's or Fitch for the carbon market. I'll say more about what that means later, but for now, we have rated about 430 carbon offset projects in 62 countries around the globe. My personal background is on the nature-based side. I'll say more about that, but as a firm, we rate projects across the entire carbon set of sectors. I think we have 25 sectors within the carbon markets of projects that we've rated. We have, in those 430 projects, that represents about 900 million tons, which is something on the order of half of the actively traded carbon market. So we're about a 160-person company based in London, but about 70 of those are scientists that work on the analytical side of the business, doing these ratings. And so, these scientists have reviewed, a huge number of projects around the world, and we work on a continuous risk framework we'll certainly talk more about later as well. We really view ourselves and the idea of ratings as a central part of building the market infrastructure that Annette talked about this morning, really moving the market from this sort of bilateral work that requires so much due diligence into this sort of, infrastructure-based sort of market that can transact efficiently in the market. We believe ratings are an important part of the future of that. So that's the company that we've built. The company overall is about 4 years old, but we've been a full-time independent ratings agency for 2 years. I'll talk more about that as well. My own background is as a forester and landscape ecologist. My PhD's in forest management. Before coming to BeZero, was the head of science at a US-based forest carbon project developer. And before that, I spent about 20 years in NGO and academic doing work on forest conservation related to climate and water in particular. Also worked in foundations, sort of bringing together some of this work with the philanthropic community previously. And I really joined the climate tech startup space a few years back simply because I was impatient. And I really saw markets as the only way to scale this thing until there is regulation someday. And we heard a lot about that this morning. But for me, that ability to scale and scale quickly because of the urgency of this particular problem that we're all fighting just really demands that we build a market for that. So that's why I'm here. And I'm really glad to be here with my fellow panelists and Jim and the rest of you. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. The first question is going to be directed to Carolina, but I want to set up some tension first. I would like to talk about the tension that exists between the excitement that exists around nature-based carbon credits and the criticism that they receive. Anybody who's been alive for the last year has probably seen a headline in some place in a major publication that is critical of a nature-based carbon credit program. It could be a forest program, it could be a soil agricultural program somewhere in the world. They get criticized for all the reasons that we heard about on the first panel. It isn't real. It's greenwashing. You're harming local communities. We just don't believe you. This is going to slow down the transition. That's one side of the ledger. But yet, there's tension. And the tension is they're popular. The tension is the government is incentivizing this to come to life. The Inflation Reduction Act had $300 million in it for the development of nature-based carbon solutions. And I'll share some other statistics with you about the growth of nature-based carbon offsetting throughout the panel today. So the premise of this panel is to discuss and understand the source of that tension. We first have to deal with the definitional issue, though, which is, Carolina, you work for an organization that is responsible for writing the rules, so to speak, about how one develops a nature-based carbon credit. Help us in the audience here understand what are nature-based carbon credits. Just give us some examples of that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jim. So that's a really hard question to explain in simple words, but I'll try my best. Nature-based carbon credits are those credits derived from emission reductions or removal, when you can sequester carbon for the atmosphere. Throughout project activities which are nature-based. For example, when you prevent deforestation or avoid deforestation, or when you practice agriculture in a sustainable way. Of course, all those activities, they do have an impact on the environment, but they can also be a solution if you do them properly in the field. And you also will have to think that nature-based solutions are so important. It's not only about climate change or sequestering carbon or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We have also to think in the bigger picture, what's the impact of nature-based? We are talking about protecting biodiversity. We are talking about food security. We are talking about problems, societal problems that we are facing there today. And we have no option if we don't look at nature-based solutions to help us to keep us ongoing and, let's say, to live, right? And I think that's why the nature-based got so much attention also nowadays. And besides of that, science has shown also it's one of the cheapest way to help us to get there. It doesn't mean that's the more important or the easiest way to go. It's one additional option that we have, because we have heard here before how expensive and difficult it is to decrease and change your, for example, industrial process to decrease emissions. But we have to start somewhere. And I think nature-based projects can help us to get started.
So can I follow up and say, imagine that I'm a rice farmer, okay, and I would like to enroll in a program to produce carbon credits. Or I could be a soybean farmer, it doesn't matter. Or some other kind of nature-based program. Could you give us a little more granular sense of what it would actually look like for that person to have to work with a Verra methodology to produce a carbon credit? How does that actually happen?
Well, everything starts with a project developer who would be interested to invest in nature-based solution projects. They have first to get a group, let's say, of farmers who are also interested and committed to change field practices to help the fighting climate change or to produce food more sustainably. And when they have this group of people getting together and want to do something good for nature, they can choose we have several methodologies in Verra. In the AFOLU sector, we have more than 20 methodologies which set the standards, which are the regulations. And we basically, in these methodologies, we have rules and regulations to comply with the core principles of a good quality carbon credits. And then we also have a set of equations to make those calculations. And how do you get the data to feed the equations to make your predictions or estimations? You can do that using model to do your predictions, or you can go to the field and take your measurements, measure soil carbon in your soil, or use chambers to measure emissions like nitrous dioxide, or in the case of rice, methane emissions. And then you do your calculations, and then, of course, you can do that annually. In the case of carbon, it's a little bit more complicated because the changes are so tiny and you need more time to capture those changes. But for other types of projects, especially those related to reducing emissions, you can do that in a more fast manner. You can do that more annually, for example, and the estimations also. And you do your calculations and you report those calculations and predictions. And then you have a verification body who's going to check your calculations to verify if they are real. if they have really been measured. And then after that, once they are validated and verified, it goes to the market, and then you can negotiate your price on the carbon that you have sequestered.
Okay, Spencer, we're coming to you next. But at a high level then, somebody decides to do something good for the environment that involves nature. That could be reforestation, it could be stopping cutting down your forest, it could be changing forest management, it could be changing the way that you grow rice or soybeans or corn or grazing animals. And if there's a carbon benefit there that is calculable, and that's what you do, that's what Verra does. It says these are the things you have to do to generate a calculable benefit. If you do those things well, then you have a carbon credit at the end of it,
Yeah.
assuming that there's an actual positive benefit.
Yeah.
Spencer, how does your organization then think about thinking through the effectiveness of that? I mean, we've talked a lot about quality, and say somebody follows a protocol, okay,
Yeah.
how do I know it's any good?
So I think we would argue that there is no test you can pass at which point you are certainly a ton. We just don't believe that's a thing at this point in time. Carbon credits are not a commodity. We would love them to be a commodity. Maybe at some point in the future they will be. And even though in the atmosphere there is global fungibility, a ton literally is a ton, the things that we produce are not yet all the same. And so what we think about is we take a continuous risk approach to evaluating carbon credits. There are ones at one end of the spectrum that we're really pretty certain are very close to, if not a full ton. And there's ones at the other end of the spectrum that are like, probably not that much of a ton, and everything in between. And over time, we want to move all those up and to the right. We want all of those to become much more like a ton. And the work that ICVCM and VCMI and other initiatives are doing are pushing everything up and to the right. They're raising the standards. They're reinventing the methodologies. We've seen, just in the last 6 months to a year, we've seen a lot of new methodologies come online by Verra and other standards. They're all improving these things and moving them up and to the right. And this is like really, really important because it's getting rid of, over time, it will get rid of the credits in the market that are down and to the left, the ones that are less likely to be a ton. In the meantime, the way we think about it is this risk continuum. So we have a whole risk framework we apply to all carbon credits no matter what the sector is. And then we have a specific methodology we look at credits within specific sectors. So there's a red, or we call it an avoided deforestation methodology, for example. We have another one for cook stoves. We have one for improved forest management. And we even have one for direct air capture at this point. And so we look at a number of different factors, and the 4 key factors that'll sound familiar to most of you are additionality, overcrediting risk, non-permanence risk or durability, we can discuss those nuances there, and leakage. And every one of these categories...
Can you define those for us, Spencer?
Yes, okay. So additionality is, the basic idea of additionality is like, would this project have happened if not for the carbon finance? Overcrediting is really how accurate or how good is the accounting that comes up with the actual number of credits that you've produced. The methodology allows you to issue 100 credits. Is that likely to be 100 credits, or is that potentially inflated because of a bunch of technical or accounting or measurement error reasons? Non-permanence risk is the risk that the carbon benefit does not last forever, which is the standard, which we'll talk more about. I personally have some problems with that as the standard because I think it's sort of a fiction in a lot of ways. And I know we'll talk more about that. And then leakage is the idea that someone fixes something over here, changes a management practice here, and either the very same person on a different field over here does something different. That's what we call activity leakage. Or the market adjusts somewhere else, and we have market leakage where a commodity producer will just produce more of something over here because the market still demands that same commodity for the same cheap price. They can no longer get it from this person for that price, so they go over here and they buy it from this other person. So those are the four key categories. There are others. There's sub factors there, but that's the top level. And we view all of them as a continuum from very high risk to very low risk. Those all add up in our risk framework to an 8-point scale. You can go from a AAA down to a D, just like the financial public debt markets is how we rate projects overall.
Imagine this scenario. Okay, there's a soybean farmer in Kansas, develops a project, uses a Verra methodology, comes to the end of it and says, I have this many carbon credits. They would like your stamp. Do you review what? Do you review the methodology? Is it an accounting kind of review? Do you actually go out to the place in Kansas and take a measurement in the field? What is the extent of the diligence that underpins the rating?
Yeah, so we, The diligence that we would do on any particular project would be a several week to a couple of month long process. So this is not someone reading a report and giving it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. We have about 70 analysts on our team that do this across the sector. So this is a very in-depth due diligence process. We have scientists who specialize in each sector, and so they would already be intimately familiar with the methodology. So they don't need to go learn that for the first time. They know all the methodologies. They have studied them inside and out. In many cases, they have provided public comment on revisions of methodologies and things like that. What we are looking at BeZero is the implementation and execution at the project level. It is not our role to revise the methodologies. There's organizations that do that already and are doing it well and are iterating rapidly. Our job is to say, did the execution of this project actually deliver, or what is the probability that it delivered the number of tons it said it did? So what our rating really means is the likelihood that every credit is either 1 ton CO2e avoided or removed or not. And so it's really focused on the carbon. We can talk about co-benefits and other safeguard risks another time. But it's really focused on the likelihood that that credit actually produced a ton. At a AAA, we're really, really close to sure that it produced a full ton. At a D, we're pretty sure it didn't produce a ton and everything in the middle. So what we would be looking at is how the project implemented the rules within the methodology from an actual implementation perspective. So methodologies might allow you to set, baselines is a really critical part of the baseline is this is what would have happened if we didn't come in and do this project, and then here's how much carbon we accumulated as a result of this project. And the delta between the two, more or less, is the number of credits you're going to get. And so we look very carefully at the baseline. Was it reasonable? In forest management baselines, a common problem is a net present value style approach that says a reasonable actor would have used a net present value with a specific discount rate and would have logged this entire forest over 30 years. If we find close to zero evidence for any other landowner with similar criteria in the county, the state, the region, the country that has ever behaved or currently behaves like that, we are going to say that is a very risky baseline to assume. And we are going to create our own baseline based on what we would think are reasonable expectations of business as usual practices, and we're going to recalibrate. And so in that case, we might say there's very high risk of overcrediting because the baseline was unreasonable. The same principle would work in an agricultural field, in renewable energy projects, or even in cook stove projects. But the details and the science around those baselines obviously varies considerably.
So we've heard a number of words here that are associated with the criticisms. We've talked about additionality. That's, would it have happened anyway? For example, in soybean farming, one thing people can do to satisfy the additionality criterion is engage in cover cropping, which is where you plant a crop between the crops over the winter. But I know a lot of people who do that anyway. They're not in a carbon program. So if somebody's claiming that they're in a carbon program and, hey, they're cover cropping, well, would the cover cropping have happened anyway is really the question. He talked about baselines. That's where you set your threshold. What is the standard against which you're being compared? All of this stuff. You talked about durability or impermanence. That's all part of the criticism. Here comes the tension. Voluntary carbon markets, Ricardo was right. It is, in fact, $2 billion in 2022. In terms of the voluntary carbon market, nature-based carbon credits made up 46% of the market share in 2022. Which kinds of credits do you think are the most valuable? Nature-based credits or technology-based credits based on an actual analysis of transactions that occurred on the voluntary carbon market? It's nature-based. Nature-based credits, the average price in 2022 was $10.17 per ton. For technology-based credits, it's $4.76. That's the tension. Nature-based credits are receiving the brunt of the criticism and is where the uncertainty actually exists around what is a ton, this question about whether a ton is a ton. And yet, there's enormous demand for them, and they're the highest price. So David, you work for an organization that is thinking about how to generate carbon credits in agriculture. I know you think a lot about these controversies because they impact your bottom line. What is your view of the controversy? Do you think they're controversial? If so, which elements of that controversy matter to you?
Yeah, I think it's very controversial. I wish it weren't, but kind of where we are now, it is. Just read the news. You'll find people talking every which way about this problem. And, I think part of this specific controversy comes from the fact that, yes, nature-based is difficult. It has a lot of issues. I have a computer science background, right? I like when things are predictable. Nature is not super predictable. It's one of those squishy sciences. It's a technical term. And, it's hard to measure. So when we think about how to move the needle on this problem, that is why Perennial focused on measurement. Decided to, if you want to create trust that something happened in an asset, you need to have a way to measure it. But, it gets back to the other point, which is, technological-based offsetting schemes are very easy to measure often. It's the tangibility of having a flow meter on the back of a device that is maybe sucking carbon out of the air versus something that you can't see or smell or touch, which is gas coming off of or going into the soil or a tree. Now, the tension, in my opinion, is nature-based stuff exists now. It's a very fast way to move the needle on this problem, and that's why it is kind of a higher price. In these cases, obviously there are examples of stuff like high-quality direct air capture, which is going for like $1,000 a ton, but we're in the dozens of tons per year range right now. We are in the hundreds of millions, at least, tons in the nature-based sector. So it's about how do you connect the massive potential opportunity and, importantly, the speed at which we can move. Using agriculture as an example, there is a farmer on 50% of the land surface area on Earth who is already managing that land. And if you can get the incentives problems right, that infrastructure is mostly already there to make changes. So that's quick, but at the same time, it is squishy. It's hard to measure. It's whatever. So how do you connect those two? We approach it through measurement and through technologies that make that more traceable and verifiable.
I just want to add something. It's not only that it's hard to measure, but it's hard out to predict. We are talking about nature. There are so many variables influence what happened to nature, and that comes together also with the issue concerning baseline. And these things, how we look at them, are also changing. That's what I think it's also, we need to be a little bit patient because there are so many things that we don't know yet, and we are learning. And I'm saying, for example, like you're saying, when you have some things to measure in the industrial process that you can measure in the real time, it's stochastic. You can predict what is in, what's out. That's not what happened with nature. It's unpredictable. And on top of that, also, the issue that generates so much controversy, we don't have data. There is a lack of data to help us to understand also. And there is also a very low investment to produce that data that we need to measure this with more confidence and decrease the uncertainty, therefore make the estimations more strong and less unpredictable, to say.
Do you think, is the issue really the measurement of the carbon quantity itself, or is the issue the other stuff, right? Because I'm hearing you talk about baselines, leakage, and I'm thinking about all the counterfactuals that I need to know to be able to judge whether a given project is genuine or not. And those counterfactuals don't exist. I have to invent them, or in some statistical way, right? This is not a clinical trial where we get to assign groups to a treatment and a control and look at the outcome. We only get the outcome. What do you think, Spencer?
I think that's right. I mean, I think, so within carbon offsets, there are a lot of technical debates. And you can go as deep as you want, and you can spend a whole career on just one of these very technical debates. But to me, at the end of the day, they really come down, every one of them comes down to a philosophical difference. Are you a purist who is going to spend as much time as possible seeking certainty about a thing? Or are you more interested in getting things going now and iterating over time? And I am very much in the latter camp. And I think that we can't wait around until we have the perfect answer to all of these things. When a lot of these methodologies were written, we didn't even have the measurement technologies that we have today, right? Like, we are, in hindsight, looking back and judging, and we ourselves are doing that, so I recognize that, are judging projects around their ability to measure things before the tools that we are measuring with them existed. That is an evolutionary thing that has to continue to happen. So even a close to perfect methodology that could be produced today will be evaluated with a technology that we have never even heard of yet. And so I think what we need for a market to really build in the way that Annette described is we need this iterative approach. We need to recognize that we can't get it all exactly right now, but that should not be a reason to not invest now. If we choose or do not help other people invest now in the market, we won't have these problems to worry about because they just won't be an option down the road. So we look at this continuum of risk now. We don't tell people what quality level, what rating level they should or shouldn't buy. We are simply providing information that people can transact on in the market. And we're actually seeing a very strong signal now on that, where price has started to correlate with the ratings. So we've looked back each of the last several quarters at all the transactions that have occurred in the quarter and overlapped that with the projects that we've rated. We haven't rated every project in the market. And there's now between a 25 and 40% increase in price of credits that are transacting for each letter grade you go up. So from a B to a double B or an A to a double A. For projects that are A and better, there's an 80% price premium in the market. So the market is recognizing the quality premium. Now, it's not just in the price, which is great news from a market theory perspective. It's also in retirements. We're starting to see a divergence in the proportion of credits that are retired. The proportion that are highly rated projects versus relatively lower rated projects is diverging. So people are choosing to retire. And at the end of the day, remember, this is not about trading. It's not about the primary market. It's about the secondary market where people are actually retiring these things.
Could you elaborate on that? Tell us what a retirement is.
Yeah, so anyone can buy a carbon offset, and they can buy and sell over and over. It just keeps moving around the economy, but it's not until somebody, quote, retires it on the registry on which that credit is tracked that the carbon benefit is actually accrued to that person, the beneficiary of that.
So that's when you actually claim the benefit.
That's when the claim actually happens. Until then, it's all just transacting, right? It's just like currency that's moving around the market. It doesn't really matter from a climate perspective until that claim is made when it's retired. And it's these retirements that really matter. It's the corporates that are retiring these credits that we're all talking about mostly when we're talking about the ultimate demand here. People are retiring higher quality credits at a faster rate than they are lower quality credits. This is exactly what we want to see. This is the theory of change that BeZero has about the market, is that if you incentivize people to produce higher quality projects, they will get paid more for them, which affords them the revenue to make more conservative decisions as they're doing the measurements, as they're doing the project activities, as they're paying the local communities to do whatever it is the local communities are doing. They will be rewarded for that. If all these credits are priced relatively similarly, there's no reason for a project developer to make a more conservative estimate. They're going to maximize the number of credits they can generate on any given methodology. And the first generation methodologies had wide latitude on assumptions you could make. And so this theory of change that we're starting to see in our own research work is really exciting to us, because that's how it should work over time. Now, when the core carbon principles come out, which we're tracking really closely, and as more methodologies sort of sunset and evolve into new ones, we would expect that quality to come up even higher. We would expect a lot of the lowest quality stuff in the market to start to filter out over time. And so this is the kind of cyclical sort of feedback loop mechanism that you want to see in the market, and that's really exciting to us.
I want to come back to components of quality and what the distinction between what we might call a kind of fundamental quality and quality as judged by the market. But before we do that, I want to actually channel a question to either Carolina or David, and it was one of the questions from the audience earlier about a ton not being a ton. So let's imagine that there's a ton that's not really a ton. Tell me how uncertainty is grappled with in the context of these calculations. Clearly, David's telling us nature is squishy. We can't know with absolute certainty what's going on. We're making a statistical estimate that has a range, a bound around it, within which we might be pretty confident or not. Is that accommodated, and if so, how?
Yeah, so uncertainty is a big issue. I think, first of all, we need to stop to be so afraid or scared of uncertainty. We need just to embrace it and measure it and report it and calculate the risks associated to that. That would be a possible way to handle this uncertainty in the quality of a carbon credit. And yeah, I don't know what else can we...
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. To summarize, yes, measuring the uncertainty is the most important part. And I think this is a big thing about ratings, too, which is let's understand where we are today and act with that information. So it's not a binary yes, no, this whole sector is good or it's not, this whole project is good or it's not. There's this sliding scale of how real things are, and that will affect price, that will affect profitability, that will affect the tracking of the purchaser toward their net zero goal, as long as we can measure it or rate it in some way, how uncertain that is, then we're okay. And we had to embrace this a lot too. So we're working on a new technology for quantification. And when we started, there did not exist a way to estimate uncertainty in the carbon measurements in a way that was compliant with leading standards. And so we had to invent it from the ground up. And when we realized this, it was all hands. We have to get this right. But I wanted to take a more kind of philosophical answer as well, which is, I think Nat in the first panel had a really good point that I often make, like almost word for word. And what you said was, do you want basically 1 billion tons of carbon removal or carbon offsets at 90% accuracy or certainty rather, or do you want 1 million at 99%? And this goes back to the very first thing I said, which is what is a drop in the bucket solution and what is an actual solution to the climate problem? I would argue that if you have a 99% certain ton, you've solved the problem of creating a carbon offset very, very well. But you've totally ignored the actual problem, which is we have 50 gigatons of emissions every year that we need to deal with. And if you can only do something that scales up theoretically to 1 million tons per year because it's extremely expensive and nobody wants to buy it or it's really hard to produce, then you didn't actually solve the problem, right? So I think nature is that approach where you have to accept more uncertainty, but in return you get much more activity and more potential, and then you actually solve the problem. Forest for the trees, no pun intended.
Yeah, it's just a final word to say, we're dealing with nature. Nature is so variable, it's so diverse. There will be uncertainty. There will never not be uncertainty there. And that's what I mean, like we really do need to embrace uncertainty and try to find a ways to minimize the risk because this uncertainty exists. Yeah.
So is that the answer to the paradox then? Is the answer to the paradox that despite the criticisms, nature is in demand and growing? I mean, remember, 46% of the voluntary carbon market is nature-based crediting. Agriculture increased by 283% year over year between 2021 and 2022. Is that simply because it's the thing that has the ability to scale to meet the demand?
Yeah, we solved it. Paradox is done. This panel will go down in history where we solved the biggest problem. No, I think it's part of it, right? I think there are a number of other things that, I don't want to jump the gun here because I know we were going to talk about it, but permanence, the time value of nature-based carbon. So this is something where, this is the other big part that I think is not really accounted for in the frameworks today, is just like nature will always be uncertain, carbon stored in natural ecosystems will always be temporary on some scale, depending on how you want to define that. And so how temporary should we go? Like what is too small, but also for things that are not 100 years, which is sort of the standard today of how long you would need to keep something in the ground. How can we actually account for those at the framework level, right? How can we, if you sell a 20-year credit or it gets reversed after 20 years, make sure that that gets re-upped? Or how do you stack them in such a way that you would have a longer, kind of perceived permanence to it?
That's back on the criticism side.
Yep.
Spencer, you want to take that?
Yes, I think this debate about permanence is really tricky because we know scientifically that in the atmosphere, the carbon does effectively stay there forever. So the desire to have things be permanent is really meant to counteract, yep, the carbon's up there, like that's not going to change. That's the science, more or less. The issue is that we don't have in society the mechanisms, we don't have the equivalent mechanisms. It's just not a thing. There's like virtually nothing in our world that in our markets, in our society, daily lives that we consider permanent. Like that's not an option. So our job as people in the carbon markets and society is to find the link between the markets and the legal frameworks that we have that can best approximate or incentivize us to get to something that looks like permanence. Like that's the middle ground. That's the interesting part. the debates around like whether your particular carbon offset is going to last for 40 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, or forever is like boring, frankly, at this point. To me, I think we really have to focus on how do we link the mechanisms to it. There's other bigger issues like, even if within one country you could come up with some legal framework for permanent, there's no international law on which that works. We've consulted with a team of lawyers that are thinking about how would you even come up with transactable units in an international legal context that guarantee something forever. So at BeZero, we take a somewhat controversial view in that we look at non-permanence risk based on the contract length of the project itself. We recognize that's not the same thing as permanence. And at the same time, we're really interested in this idea that we want to know the likelihood that the project actually delivers on what the project said it would deliver. The project varies depending upon the methodology and what standard it's on and all that. So that's where we look at the primary non-permanence risk. We also are spending a lot more time thinking about the durability, and that is this longer societal system-level impact. At the first panel, a couple of people, I think Rachel and Nat made really well about you're changing the economics of a system, of a community, of an agricultural subsector. That is a permanent shift that has durability in that landscape. That's very different than the actual contract and the number of credits. So it's a very difficult topic. It's very complicated. There's been a lot of debates around it. But again, it comes back to this paradigm I said earlier, like you're either a purist who are going to wait till you have a perfect solution, or you're going to get things going and figure it out as you go. And yeah.
So it seems like the market should care about the duration of that contract and also about the durability of the carbon credit itself. And those are not the same thing, as you noted. The durability of the credit itself is how long is this carbon actually going to stay in the forest or in the ground or wherever. We could think about making a deposit in a bank account and it's going to be held there. The contract is about your ability to deliver to me that which I am buying from you.
Yep.
Right? Does the value of the credit today seem to care about that distinction?
That's a complicated question. There's not a clear answer to that. But let me try to use an analogy. When you buy a car, let's imagine you're a person that keeps a car for 10 years. I know a lot of people don't. But you don't look around for a set of tires that are going to last you the full 10 years. You buy the set of tires that's either rated at like, these will last 30,000 miles, or you can pay a little more and you can get the 40,000 mile version, or maybe you can buy the 50 or 60,000 mile version. And you run them out and they wear down and you buy a new set and you keep going and you perpetuate, you are incentivized to buy a product knowing that it will not last forever. That doesn't stop you from buying tires from your car, right? That's just not the system that we have. And the cost of those things that you expect to last longer is higher because you're getting more value for it. Over time, that's what we expect to happen in carbon credits as well. Now, the difference between these things that are considered truly permanent, like engineered removals, enhanced rock weathering, those things that ostensibly are permanent or longer lasting, are trading at the very few that are available are trading at very high prices. That's not just because they last longer, although that is a component of the price. It has to do with their price curve is just still really high. Within the nature-based sector, there's some anecdotes that people are paying more for things that last longer, but I haven't seen any evidence that it shows up like in a real sort of data-driven kind of analysis. But over time, you would expect that to happen because we know all nature-based credits are in some form temporary. It might be that people have to replace them. You buy one and it lasts you 60 years, and maybe in 60 years you have to buy it again. Those ideas haven't really been written yet. Those mechanisms haven't been written yet. And I think that's something the market on the claim side will have to solve over time as well. But we're just not ready to solve that quite yet in my mind.
Carolina?
I just want to add that this issue with permanence also is very much related to the science behind it, because the emissions that we have, the calculations for carbon equivalent today are all based on the 100 years predictions for the warming potentials of those greenhouse gases. And I think we need to also watch out for these new metrics. For example, when we talk about methane and the GWP20, for example, to see the value of certain types of gas that can make huge contributions in the short term. And how we're going to price that also. And I think also not only focus in permanence, but also have a look and calculate the risk of reversals. which is perhaps more manageable to handle than the issue of permanence, that it's so far away and we cannot really predict it.
Okay, so in response to that, there's a question coming to you, David Schurman. Reversals was just used. Talk to us about reversals, buffer pools, and dynamic baselines.
Oh, good. All right, so the glossary of terms here, reversals are used to refer to events which would kind of threaten or re-emit carbon that was stored somehow or avoided to be emitted somehow. So an example of that is you protect forests and you claim avoided deforestation credits for that, and then the forest burns down. Or in agriculture, if you switch a farm to no-till and cover cropping, which help to retain and build carbon in the soil, and then the farmer 5 years later tills up the soil and re-releases all of that carbon, that would be a reversal. One of the proposed kind of ways to mitigate that is what's called the use of buffer pools. And this is a methodological thing at the level of the registry or the registry standard, where it is a shared pool of credits that come in from all of the projects and are used to compensate for reversals. So what this looks like in practice is maybe 20% of the credits that get quantified from a project go into this pool instead. And they can't be retired, they don't get sold, they go into this pool. And then if one of the forests burns down, the idea is that the buffer pool, since it's a shared pool, is big enough to account for things like that. Now, there are things where you can go over the amount that you have in the buffer pool. So if all the forests burn down, that would be a problem. But that is one of the mechanisms that we have here. Then finally, dynamic baselining this is how you assess, what we were talking about, the baseline, the counterfactual scenario of what would have happened. So do you consider that the dynamic, the baseline scenario is changing over time, right? So this would be looking at, okay, how do I project what would have happened forward through time and then take the difference between that and what I'm observing now, as opposed to looking at a point in time saying, okay, here's what was going on, so we're just going to assume that this is going to stay the same forever.
Can I give a quick example of why the dynamic baseline matters? We just had a group of about 30 scientists at Yale for the last 2 days talking all about additionality in this. And one of the examples that we cited a lot was if you're talking about an avoided deforestation RED project and your baseline is predicated on the idea that there is development pressure or deforestation pressure from the cattle industry, and it's nearby, you can see it, on the horizon, if you will, and it's coming, and over the next 20 years, it's likely to happen to this property as well. And then something in the macroeconomics change and the cattle industry collapses, that threat over time changes, or the profile of that threat, the frequency of the threat, the volume of the threat changes over time. In forestry timber markets, you can imagine a mill going out of business would change the threat characterization of the forest that is in the woodshed of that thing. The dynamic baseline is meant to account for those changes in macroeconomic and other physical factors that might adjust through time, so that the credits you're issuing, not just in that first year, but in another 5 years and another 10 years, you're basing on the new revised baseline as well. So it's a really important thing, but it's a cutting edge thing right now. There's a lot of science that's evolving around it. Not everyone knows how to do it. There's a lot of, again, uncertainty. But the industry is kind of moving that way eventually, but isn't quite there yet in the mainstream. But that's an example of why that's really important.
So there's a follow-up here. This is for you, Spencer, or you, Carolina, or both of you. The California forest carbon markets have been criticized related to this buffer pool and baseline concept. The baseline criticism is you've selected the baseline that makes it look as if your project is extraordinarily successful, but in reality, you just chose a baseline that makes you look good. The buffer pool concept is that it's not big enough. It's specifically been criticized as undercapitalized, meaning there aren't enough credits in the buffer pool to actually make whole the project, given the rate of forest fires that are actually happening in California. So the questions are, for you, Carolina, at a methodology level, is that something that's thought about? And for you, Spencer, at the ratings level, is that something that's thought about?
I think with with baseline assessment, we have improved and learned a lot over the years. Like before, we used to look in the historical period and establish a baseline. With this concept now, with dynamic baseline, we can make a comparison estimation of what is really happened, not what happened before, but it's more a real-time comparison, because you are dynamic and we are evaluating two scenarios against each other in a real time. I think that was a huge improvement for assessment of baseline.
We certainly look pretty heavily at buffer pools, and here is where we look carefully what the methodology requires and what the project actually contributes to the buffer pool. And this, there's a number of different categories of risk where buffer pools matter. I mean, the first is non-permanence because of the reversal risk. The other is information risk. So for example, if you can't tell on a registry what kind of credits have been put in place, you don't know if there's a like for like. So for example, if you put in credits into the buffer pool from a red project and the buffer credits that you put in are from a renewable energy project, and I should say not all the standards have the same criteria. Some require like for like, some do not. The risk profile of the ones in the buffer pool is very different from the risk profile of the ones you're actually worried about. So if the project you're worried about burns down and you replace them, and those were really good credits, let's say, and you replace them with credits that really weren't very good, let's say, you have a non-permanence risk there. Even though you look like you've replaced those credits, you have not replaced the climate benefit. So for us, like there's a few really key issues, so we look at that very carefully, and over time, we would love to see more transparency about what kinds of credits get put into the buffer pool and how they relate to the credits that are getting replaced from the buffer pool. I'll stop there. Yeah.
Why do we have a buffer pool at all? I mean, what I'm thinking about here is...
So reversal. So there are natural disturbances. Fire was mentioned, like that's a really important one. So for example, we track fire in an almost near real-time fashion in every carbon project around the world. Our geoscience team spends a lot of time building the tools to be able to do that because we want to understand where fires are more prevalent. We want to understand where pest and disease outbreaks are, because places where those are common, there are higher risks of the buffer pool being needed. Therefore, buffer pool contributions should be larger. There are other places where natural disturbance risk is really quite low, and sometimes the buffer pool is well, the pool isn't overcapitalized, but the contribution from that project is arguably very conservative. In that case, we would say there's very low risk. There are intentional reversals. Different standards handle that differently. If a developer or the landowner just chooses to walk away from a project, sometimes they're required to compensate directly. Sometimes those can come out of the buffer pool depending upon the standard. But there's really quite a few reasons why the buffer pool could be drawn on.
So it's there because of risk, essentially.
It
Right.
is a risk
And-
mitigation mechanism at the standards level. We now, with the sector level, we now have insurance companies that have come to the market, and there's a few startup carbon-specific insurance companies, and then there's also some of the big traditional insurance companies who are building products to layer on top of that. These are insurance products that would be for the buyers, the holders of the credits. But again, this is another example of there's another piece of market infrastructure that's starting to look like a real market, as opposed to these things that have been cobbled together over time to get us started. We're starting to look like a mature market with all these different components that any other market, financial market or otherwise, would have in it.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is the types of risk that can be absorbed by these buffer pools. Like it's not just does something burn down or does the climate change or was there some release. These things also cover the topic that everyone has been discussing, the projects that turn out not to be real, right? You find out someday that a project was not real, it's a big scandal, it's whatever. What people don't talk about as much is that can get absorbed through the buffer pool. And there are some dynamics there, of course, and we need more of this, but that's a good way to protect against other things that would threaten the market, I think. And if we can standardize those and make those a little bit more clear, that's the direction things need to head.
And I would say buyers are getting a lot more sophisticated about understanding this continuum of risk. So there's insurance offerings. Some of the marketplaces or carbon aggregators are starting to build in risk into how they design their own portfolios of credits and producing sort of risk mitigated credits. And we'll hear from my colleague Jen Jenkins from Rubicon in a little while, where they're doing that and providing this sort of risk mitigated carbon offset product essentially into the marketplace. We have a lot of people coming to us directly. I've been talking a lot about what we call ex post ratings. Those are ratings we do about projects that have already issued credits in the market. But for every one of those, there's a whole bunch of other new project finance that's happening as we speak that's looking to develop the next generation supply. And they want to understand those risk profiles much earlier in the process before they even come to market, before they even issue those credits. And so we're doing risk profiling, risk analyses for these, what we call ex-ante or sort of pre-issuance credits as well. The general point being buyers are looking at this much earlier in the process and looking how they can mitigate some of those risks, partly because they don't want them to go up in smoke, and partly because they might want to fetch a higher price if they're a developer or they're a project finance investor.
So a follow-up before we go to Carolina about co-benefits is one criticism I've heard from people in this room is that insurance is never going to work on this. And the reason they say is that, well, I'll give you the story. Imagine that I'm a company that's bought a carbon credit. We heard about Brown's effort to purchase carbon credits this morning. Okay, and it turns out that there was an error. There's a good faith error, but there was an error and the credits weren't genuine. And so an insurance company says, Professor Porter, we're very sorry. Here's your money back. And he's going to say, but I want my atmospheric damage avoided that I paid for. Right? It's not just a financial problem because the nature of the product that you're purchasing is both a financial transaction, but also about doing something out there in the world. Spencer, or anybody who thinks they could speak to this, are insurance companies thinking about that? Like, this doesn't feel like replacing the roof on my house.
Well,
It feels like something different.
That is a debate that's happening right now. Some insurance companies are replacing like for like, and some are replacing with cash. And that's like an ongoing debate that's happening. We'll see which philosophy wins. But I agree, it's not the same thing as replacing the roof on your house.
I would suggest that the amount of things and the diversity of things that get insured today, like if there's money to be made there for an insurance company, they will find a way. And yeah, you quantify the risk. You make an actuarial table for this. It's an entirely new practice, but they will find a way. Insurance companies are already looking 50 to 100 years out, pricing in climate change today. So we'll find a way. It's just this whole kind of set of categories of when you get the incentives problems right and prove that there is a market here and money to be made by filling certain roles in that market, then it'll go. So I don't know how. I'm not an insurance person, but I have faith in our AIG and whatever else. It's literally the only one I can name, but I have faith that they'll figure it out.
I should say that our ratings are being used in at least 2 of the insurance companies who are using ratings to start parameterizing their own risk assessments.
Carolina, you talked to us about some benefits. You were talking early on when you were defining nature-based programs. You mentioned co-benefits of biodiversity. You mentioned food security. I wonder if you could speak to that and the degree to which those are or are not in the ratings. And where I want to go with this is I want to go to a bigger conversation about what co-benefits are in the broad sense, what they are in particular from each of your viewpoints, and then end with you, Spencer, on how or not co-benefits are ending up in the ratings. So what are some examples of co-benefits, and are they actually in there? Like when a person purchases a carbon credit, to me it's a ton of carbon, and the co-benefits are just a positive externality. But are there situations where it's actually built into the definition of what the carbon credit represents?
Yeah, the co-benefits of carbon credits, they are not really measured direct or giving value to that direct to some programs out there. But there are other programs that you can stack, for example, programs. In Verra, for example, you have the VCS programs where you measure the carbon that you sequestered, but you also have another programs that you can measure the co-benefits of generating these carbon credits, and you can also measure them to some extent. But there is a lot of debate there about how to measure these co-benefits, and because it's also contextual. Each project, you generate different co-benefits. What might be a co-benefit in, let's say, in Brazil, it's in a specific soybean production in Brazil, will not be the same if you produce wheat in UK, for example. And the co-benefits associated to that, they have different metrics and possibly also different values then. And that's still to be better understood and to attribute a value to that. But that's evolving, and I think it will come.
David, before you respond, I'd like to point out to you that there was a price premium for co-benefits. It's 78% in 2022. So people are paying 78% more for carbon credits that are on the voluntary carbon market when there's a clearly definable co-benefit associated with it. Is this something you think about?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think co-benefits are really easy to quantify qualitatively, but very hard to do quantitatively. Did I get that right? I don't know. It's hard to actually measure numbers associated with co-benefits, and they're higher up even than carbon on the squishy scale of nature of, you know, how many people, what types of biodiversity, how many new species of butterflies. It's difficult and expensive. But it makes perfect sense because especially the voluntary nature of these markets, right now they're all kind of going on feel-good, consumer sentiment. You know, companies want consumers to feel like they are making a positive impact, which should hopefully in turn somehow have a impact on their business. And I think co-benefits support that story. It is also very easy to tell a story, relatively speaking, compared to carbon of we saved this many species, we helped a lot of local communities, and other things like that. So, you know, what I think is interesting about this is rather than trying to build these into a credit necessarily, I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift toward direct investment into actually starting new projects instead of purchasing the outcomes of projects that have already happened, right? And so then you can sort of claim those co-benefits along with the carbon yield of that project in a way that is more holistic, where we actually put up, you know, $10 million and restored this forest, and here's what happened. And we don't know exactly how much carbon that's going to come out with, but, you know, we're going to claim the stuff that it does. So it's a subtle mental shift. And Jim told me this anecdote, again, of Stephen, of thinking through the offset strategy of, you know, there was the idea to do CFC destruction, so chlorofluorocarbon destruction, destroying this very potent greenhouse gas that comes from refrigerants. And your thinking was, I don't want to pay for somebody who has already destroyed some CFCs. I want to pay somebody to go take more CFCs and destroy them. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And I thought about it, and I was like, wait, that actually does make sense. You're paying for an activity that is, by definition, additional because you paid somebody to do it. So I think co-benefits kind of fit well within this finance narrative of we're going to put up money up front. And I think nature is a good way to soak up dollars like that. And it's a compelling story for corporates who want to have action.
Spencer, are co-benefits reflected in either your ratings or in your assessment of the value of credits?
Before I answer that, I should say that in the first half of my career, carbon was the co-benefit in forest conservation. And a lot of people I know that come out of the sort of forest ecology or conservation or ENGO movement broadly, they were focused on all those other things, the biodiversity in particular, the water quality, the timber value, you know, protecting timber value over time. And it was when carbon became something people would pay you for that it started to take over as the primary good, right? It was the promise of an ecosystem service market. Like, we don't even say that anymore. I can't remember the last time I talked about an ecosystem service market. I know, I see you chuckling for good reason, I know, right? But it was like, oh wait, someone's gonna pay me for that particular co-benefit? Suddenly this is a carbon project. And I think that's where a lot of the underpinnings of the carbon market came from and where we are. Now we're talking about the other way around. We're like, well, let's pay someone to do a thing. Let's get some carbon out of it. Oh, and by the way, there's a bunch of other benefits. There's biodiversity benefits. There might be social and equitable benefits in a community. You know, cook stoves is a great example, right? Sometimes the credits are overestimated in some cases, but that takes nothing away from the respiratory health benefits of the typically women who are using these cook stoves, right? That's gold. That's something you want to do. You want to incentivize. You want to transfer more wealth to the global south. A lot of that has to do with the co-benefits and the other reasons. It's not about carbon. So it's very complicated how these things interact. I would say that our ratings, first and foremost, are about the carbon. So the definition I said earlier is the letter rating is the probability that it's delivering 1 ton CO2e or not. So that's the first and foremost. So you could have like really, really great co-benefits on a project and be pretty mediocre on carbon. Like, you're gonna get a pretty mediocre rating on it. So our ratings, to answer your question explicitly, our ratings do not directly include co-benefits. However, there are a number of safeguards which are a closely related topic of things you want to, mechanisms by which you avoid doing harm. It's kind of the other side of the co-benefits side. Co-benefits we think is the positive impacts. Safeguards are avoiding the negative impacts. We include quite a few of these safeguards in our analysis because they directly contribute to the risk of the carbon project. So benefit sharing is a common one people talk about. If you are extracting all the value out of a community by taking their carbon credits and giving them a very small portion of the proceeds, not only is that bad for ethical and financial reasons, but you're actually jeopardizing the future of that carbon project because those people on the ground are less likely to keep doing the thing you need them to do to generate the carbon credits, the durability. So we would view that as like a very distinct non-permanence risk. And there's a whole host of other ways in which safeguards, again, closely related to co-benefits, show up in our carbon analysis. We have recently launched on our platform, where all the details of all our ratings are, a section where you can see all the SDGs and all the safeguards that are claimed by every project that has claimed them. I should say so far the first launch will be about Verra and Gold Standard on the platform to have these. Over time, as we get better at integrating those into our analytical ratings, not our data-driven assessments, but our analytical ratings, we'll include those more for sure.
I think what is really difficult to measure the co-benefits also because it's beyond a quantitative value. It's about the impact. It's more than that. Even like when you sequester maybe a large amount somewhere might generate less co-benefits than a very small amount, let's say in a place where the resources are so limited and so degraded. And I think we need to look at this perspective also. It's more than the co-benefits in quantitative terms, but it's the impact that it has, you know?
It is very difficult to think through, isn't it? It seems like at some level it becomes a values-based question, some of these co-benefits. Some of them you could imagine quantifying, the impact of reduced pesticide exposure on people's health, but even then, over a long time, it's going to be very challenging. I've also heard the argument put forward that, and I'd love to know what you think about this, that in some sense the co-benefits, though clearly they're valuable to people based on data. Clearly people value them, but maybe it's a distraction because it's attempting to weight the value of something unrelated to the climate with something related to the climate. And the argument is that the best thing we could do for the future of people is to not have climate change take place. Any thoughts on that?
The carbon market itself, from a strictly carbon perspective, has already been bogged down in these highly technical debates that we've talked about here. And people can't agree on all these details. Many of the co-benefits, I'll use biodiversity in particular, is dramatically more complex than carbon. The first principle we talked about is like in the atmosphere, a ton is a ton, right? They're fungible, it doesn't matter where it is around the globe. It's the collective concentration that matters. That is exactly the opposite in biodiversity, right? You can't say you increase like the diversity of bird habitat in one place and that's like increasing jaguar habitat in another place, right? And I mean, there's just hugely difference there. So if we have these highly technical debates on the carbon side that we have not been able to solve yet, when we get to the point of trying to solve those on biodiversity, not to mention other co-benefits, it will be even more complex. So I think we will need a philosophically different approach to it than we've taken with carbon markets. I hope, my strong hope is that we take a lot of lessons from the carbon markets so we don't make those same mistakes, because we'll be sitting here in 30 years discussing what additionality looks like for early successional bird habitat. That would be a bad outcome for the world if we're still talking about that in 30 years. But that's what would happen in my mind. Now, there are a number of people trying to stand up biodiversity-like markets. There are a few transactions out there happening. Some of them are quasi-public-private sort of funded things, and there's really good progress being made there. I think it's unclear whether they're going to be part of the carbon market or whether they're going to be standalone markets, and it's an interesting debate that's happening. We see it all the time. We're paying attention to it, but we collectively as a community, I think, are a long way away from having that integration.
I think it's at least progress, though, that probably 30 years ago, again, I wasn't there, but biodiversity market used to mean selling exotic animals on the black market, and now it means protecting different species in different places and trying to have a way for companies to get involved in that. So, baby steps.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to questions from the audience.
Again, please come up to the mic so people on Zoom can hear.
I'm trying to understand, the market mechanics. BeZero Carbon, the rating agency, as well as Verra and Perennial, your business model, who pays them? Are they the project developers that pay your fees?
I'll speak just for us. So our business model is we have a platform. So I should say at the top, our headline ratings are freely available to anybody. You can just log in briefly to our account, to our website, and then anybody can see our headline ratings. If you want the deep due diligence, all the risk analysis under it and the mapping and all the things that go with it, you subscribe to our platform. And so people pay us for subscriptions to our platform. They can also commission us to do ratings that we haven't done yet. There sometimes are projects that have a lot of issuance in the market that people want to know. We haven't gotten to it yet because we can't do everything all at once, and so we would go and rate that. We also do these private pre-issuance ratings I mentioned. They're bilateral agreements with any customer that is looking to develop a project. Sometimes that's a project finance group, sometimes it is a project developer, sometimes it's an off-taker who wants us to vet the project they are considering buying from or investing in. So that's our core business model. Our ratings also show up on several other marketplaces. These are resellers of carbon credits out there, and our ratings recently started showing up on the Bloomberg terminal. So we have an API product that we sell as well that people can access our data and show our ratings on other platforms.
Before we go over here, Spencer, is there any situation where the conflict of interest that BeZero might have is different from what you would get with Standard & Poor's or Moody's?
So our founders come out of the finance markets, and the president of our company's worked for 30 years in the finance ratings agency world. And so we, from the beginning, set up a Chinese wall between our commercial and our ratings analyst team. We have very strict conflict of interest policies in-house about what we can and can't do, and who we can work with on what types of activities. So it's a common question that comes up. We get paid upfront to do a rating, so there's no you don't get to pay for a better rating. We also don't advise. When we rate a project, people almost always ask us to tell them what they can do better, how they can get a better rating, and we decline to do that. We give them very detailed reports that they can take to their other consultants and do what they want with, but we're not going to tell them how to get a better rating, but we will show them our methodologies and we will give them our honest assessment.
I have a question. So I'm an ecosystem ecology PhD student, and I'm going to show both my bias here and my ignorance about carbon markets. But and also a Brown alum. Last time I was in this room, I was graduating, so fun to be back. So I'm thinking about a ton being a ton, and in the atmosphere for sure. On land, I feel like it's complicated by other processes that ton of carbon might be. The albedo of that location, fluxes of other greenhouse gases, how it affects below ground carbon changes, that sort of thing. And I'm wondering in both protocols and in verification and in ratings, sort of how those things are taken into account. I know that in the ag sector, there's emissions factors for non-CO2 GHGs. My understanding is there's less of that incorporated in the forest sector. And I'm thinking about this not just in sort of /quibbling over are we missing 1%, but in how that might affect over-crediting or under-crediting risk. If we're not thinking about methane uptake in forest soils or N2O production in tropical forest soils. So where does that, is that a science limitation? Is there a possibility to incorporate those things? What are we missing if we're not doing that?
So can I repeat the question back? So I interpret your question as asking about, say there's a project designed to take CO2 out of the atmosphere in some place. But you're saying maybe the activities on site produce methane, just as an example. And you're asking if all those things are being comprehensively addressed. Is that the question?
So activities on site involved in the project, but also the natural processes involved in whatever sort of change happens or is avoided on that site. If we're crediting for above ground carbon stored, but not considering the natural fluxes of methane or N2O, how does that affect sort of, where we might be over or under crediting with these projects, and what are their problems?
Okay, so maybe Carolina can address it from a methodology perspective, and David can address it from a practical perspective.
From the methodology perspective, it has to be captured in the project boundary, right? When you listed what are your source of greenhouse gas emissions through your project activity, and we are also tracing the other gas. We not only measuring the CO2 sequestration or storage. But in agricultural projects, for example, we are also quantifying the changes in N2O fluxes because of your project activity. If you are changing, for example, fertilizer management practices, and these are also being quantified. And you have to make an assessment to see the materiality of this change. If there is a threshold, 5% change, you have to report. If it's increase or decrease, and quantify them and convert to carbon or CO2 equivalent.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it really is a quality of the standard question. And this is something that I know groups like ICVCM are looking at is, do you draw the boundary properly? So the boundary is, what do you consider in scope for the project and related activities and pools of GHGs that might get affected, and what do you consider out of scope? So you need to draw that around the things that we really, at this point, well understand are related. So yeah, in your ag example, when you apply too much nitrogen fertilizer, you get excess nitrogen in the soil, and that gets broken down by microbes and turned into nitrous oxide, which is almost 300 times more potent than CO2, pound for pound. So that's very important to consider. If there's livestock, you need to consider methane. You might even want to consider methane in soils if you're in a flooded ecosystem. So all of these things come together, but yeah, it's really up to the standard, and that is one of the things that separates respected standards and registries from ones that are maybe less so.
Yeah, that's also important why we have so many methodologies, because it's really depend of the project activity, and each methodology going to set different project boundaries, which is to account for those variabilities in the greenhouse gas source of emissions.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining today. The way I look at nature-based solutions is kind of like three-pronged, I guess. It's the scale of abatement for nature-based solutions, the scale of annual emissions, and then the timing of these natural systems. So I'm curious how you guys, if everything goes right, obviously this isn't the silver bullet solution to climate change, but in scaling up nature-based solutions, given that each project is so idiosyncratic, and I guess, David, you could probably speak to this point because you're providing a way to analyze kind of like foundationally. But how do you guys envision the scaling over the next 10, 20, 30 years of nature-based solutions, given annual emissions and natural systems' ability to kind of sequester carbon?
Yeah, I guess I'll start quickly and then want to hear from the others as well. But I think scaling depends really on two factors. This is a little reductionist because there's a lot going on the policy side, but technology and people with specific knowledge and the right relationships. So we're on the technology side, we're measurement, right? So if you can make a technology that can measure more diverse or heterogeneous ecosystems, that is very helpful without drastically ballooning cost. You can also use technology to optimize workflows, optimize things on the ground, go from right now, a lot of these markets are using PDFs written by humans to have all digital and digitally native, right? So I think that's important, but you really need, again, to your point about how diverse all of this stuff is, you need people on the ground who understand each piece of land or will work with the people on the ground to help them make this transition. So this is why it's so important to work with indigenous people in local communities where you can in these projects, because they understand the land best and they are going to treat it best. In the ag example, with a farmer, we have to somehow figure out how to do agriculture in this new way, and there are a lot of success stories about that. So how do we take those farmers that have made that transition and go to similar areas with similar soil types and everything and make that as well? So I think those are the two components, but I want to hear from others.
Yeah, I think it's going to scale. There's so many place to invest to scale natural-based solution projects. It doesn't help if you have a perfect methodology which measure everything very precisely with very low uncertainty and you calculate everything. But you also need capacity building. You need people to help farmers to implement those good practices. You need people You need to work on laboratory analysis, for example. And at the same time, you need to make this project more cost-effective, and that's the place of new technology can help also to scale. Yeah,
I think I would just add that a lot of the corporate commitments that our colleagues earlier were speaking about were several to many years out. And so in the early years of those commitments, I think there's a lot of kind of dabbling going on, like learning the market of what it's going to look like, investment in new opportunities, so that when the big tranche of credits are really needed by some of these companies, when it's time to meet their commitments, and it remains to be seen if the commitments themselves get reinvented, that's where the volume will probably really come. In the meantime, there's a market that's being built. One of the bottlenecks in the market, I think, that is maybe underappreciated, but we might see more in a couple of years, is that the capacity of the organizations through which these credits have to run could become a constraint pretty quickly. So the validation and verification buys, the so-called VVBs, near as I can tell, are at capacity or over capacity now. And so if ramping up happens quickly and more people are coming to Verra as new methodologies and new projects get registered, something's going to have to be done about that bottleneck. And I think there's a lot of technological initiatives going on now to sort of do a more futuristic version of some of that, and people are moving in that direction generally. But there's not only the demand signal is necessary for the supply, but I think we have to get rid of a couple bottlenecks in the system as well.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna McFadden. I'm a Brown 2020 alum. My question is on the simple side. Say, hypothetically, I work for a large industrial manufacturer who has a lot of resources to put towards carbon credits. I'm scared of purchasing carbon credits because of the recent lawsuits. That being said, in order to completely meet my net zero targets or carbon neutrality targets, I will need to purchase some carbon credits to offset my Scope 3 emissions. What would be the best way of doing this? Would be, tropical forests, temperate forests, high ratings, co-benefits? Give me a roadmap. What's the best way to do this?
Yes.
I think you give your response to that. I think all of that, but it really depends. In this hypothetical situation, what is your company's interest to support? And what the impact you want to make. I would be biased to say you should invest in tropical forests and in tropical countries. Yeah.
I would just say that there's not one sector or one methodology right now that is like completely low risk. I think there's a lot of variation within sectors. We have about 5% of our ratings are A or higher. We have not found what we would consider a AAA rated project yet. Mm-hmm. But of those 5%, single A's and double A's, they're all over the place in terms of what kinds of actual projects they are, and they span a number of different methodologies. So I would say, find yourself a partner. If you don't have the big due diligence team in-house, which some of the big companies do, find one of the firms that does that for you, or work with one of the partner organizations that has that kind of information. But do it. And I love the fact that you said, despite the controversies, we have to do this anyway. Like, that is exactly the attitude that the market needs, and there are people doing that. And those are the leaders that are setting the stage for the masses that'll come along. So thank you for doing that in your hypothetical scenario.
I mean, there's certainly masses coming along. If you've seen any net zero from any of the large corporations, there's going to be a huge purchase of carbon offsets in the next 5 to 10 years. It's all going to come right at once, so be prepared.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Anthony. I'm a current senior here at IBIS as well as in the CS department. And my question surrounds some of the examples you guys were using were often about saying oh, maybe there's a rice farmer or a soybean farmer who wants to get their land or their project certified, get a credit for it. A lot of Global South examples. But it seems like a lot of these methodologies are very complex and could be they could cost a lot. So for those, let's say, farmers who are in the Global South, or in developing areas, how are they affording this, and what proportion of each carbon credit, the value of each carbon credit, has to go towards these overhead costs?
Yeah, that's a very important question. And we in Verra, I have to say, we have been looking closely to it and try to figure out how to bring smallholders to the market. and recognize their contributions also. I think there will possibly, with the Scope 3 emissions, we hope there will be a big opportunity, but in terms of methodology, you are right. Unfortunately, so far, we still cannot find ways to work with smallholders. But I think once also the innovation technology came into place and projects more cost-effective, they will certainly be more integrated and have the opportunity to join. And we should definitely support them, right? And because they have a really important role in food security as well, despite of all other co-benefits.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think this is an important way of thinking about a co-benefit that is actually quantifiable, which is how much money or what share of the credit went to the people on the ground doing the work. Because for reference, I'm going to use ag as an example because it's what I know. U.S. carbon programs are paying about 70% to the farmer, which is pretty good, right? But also, it's very expensive in the U.S. to run a farming operation. Now, say you're in East Africa, selling a credit for $20 giving 70% of that to the farmer is a much bigger lever on that person's operations. So again, it's like bringing U.S. dollars to other parts of the world. You can do that. But then the question becomes, how do you stop the project developer from saying, okay, we're going to pay you 10% because it's still going to be a good enough impact for you and we're just going to take the lion's share, right? So if you actually have a reporting mechanism for that, it's like, did you take 90% of the profit or did you actually share it equally with the person on the ground? That could be something that's really powerful. I kind of just came up with that idea. I'm sure I'm not the first, but cool.
Yeah, but I think also the problem is beyond what a methodology can solve. It's also at the political level and how to bring these people together. How can a small holder farmer get access to funding, to new technologies to improve land management? That it's way beyond what a methodology can solve, and I think all of this needs still to come together.
Awesome, thank you guys.
Hi, my name is Aisha. I'm a senior at Brown. My question was regarding uncertainty. We talked a lot about the complexity of nature and these solutions and evaluating them. And I was wondering if you would be able to provide an example of the way that you evaluate the inherent uncertainty of nature itself, and if you do that beyond factoring in reversals, like beyond the scope of reversals.
So do you mean deeper than the quantification, there's the uncertainty that exists in the fundamental science that underpins whether we believe the answer to the quantification or not?
Also, I think the panel was talking about just the inherent uncertainty of, I guess I'm not sure if it was regarding the science of nature or just the unpredictability of nature itself, and then how you
I can try that in a couple different ways. I think there's at least two categories we talked about. There's measurement uncertainty, and then there's uncertainty of what's going to happen to that land absent the carbon project. So let's take the latter first. I use the example of fire. Forests again. So some forests are more prone to fires than others. As climate change continues to happen, that propensity for fire itself will change. So there's a feedback loop there that gets super complicated. There's a lot of uncertainty around that we can't necessarily handle in a highly quantitative way. But what we can handle in a highly quantitative way is fire mapping, that we have a team that does this and tracks fires and where they're likely to happen, and therefore what the likelihood of a given carbon project having a reversal as a result of a fire. The same thing is true of pests in agriculture, or pests in forests too, but also in agriculture. So there's what would happen on the ground otherwise. There's economic uncertainties around what the markets would do absent carbon. I use the example of timber markets and mills, right? There's some uncertainty associated with the mill infrastructure and how that impacts the land management that would have happened otherwise without those. So there's a few examples on the management and natural resource side. On the measurement side, not very long ago, every carbon project in a forest was measured by someone out there with a tape measure measuring the size of trees and estimating how much carbon was in them using a series of equations. And that is still done for sure, but is increasingly moving to a remote sensing-based world, which is allowing things to happen a lot cheaper, which makes it more accessible to smaller landowners. But it also changes the profile of the measurement uncertainty, and that's probably a whole nother conversation. But that is something that anyone developing these baselines should be tracking very carefully, is what your measurement uncertainty is, because if the delta of your additionality is smaller than the uncertainty on your baseline, well, you've got a problem. There's no credits there. So at a minimum, your activity scenario, it's called, has to be well above the uncertainty on your baseline. So you need to know what that is.
Hi, how are you guys doing? My name is Mason. I'm a junior here at Brown studying geospatial machine learning, and my question's also related to uncertainty. My question is more from the lens of remote sensing. I wanted to ask if you guys think that carbon credit pricing will improve at scale as more CubeSats, more constellations are being launched. Do you think that we will be able to kind of overcome some of the fundamental science problems, or do you think that there is going to be an inherent uncertainty in the carbon credit market?
I don't know if someone like placed you in the audience to ask about this, but this is basically all I think about. So at Perennial, we fundamentally believe that from first principles, a lot of this has to be remote sensing. It is the only technology that is seeing, satellite remote sensing specifically, and it's the only technology that sees the massive, massive land areas that you need in order to implement nature-based solutions regularly with high accuracy and kind of, a bunch of different types of doing the sensing that you can use to derive biological and physical parameters of the ecosystem to quantify carbon. So from first principles, it kind of just makes sense. It's only going to get better as satellites themselves improve. We personally use the government satellites because it is actually too expensive to use the private ones now and still make the cost basis that we need to. Even the government satellites are getting better. And as far as any new set of technologies and suite of systems goes, the price is going to come down over time, and the quality and quantity of data is going to increase. So I think that's one of the big unlocks. And I'll just do kind of a quick plug as well. You mentioned, Spencer, that there are a lot of the forest space is shifting to remote sensing right now. What we specifically do is we're trying to do that with soil as well. And that might sound a little counterintuitive, but happy to explain how that works to anybody after. Also, you're doing geospatial and data science at Brown. Where was that when I was here? So.
Just a short answer, it's a very good career choice for you right now.
Yeah, you looking for internships? No, okay.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think it's very promising indeed. It's very promising. We are very hopeful that it will grow fast as we need. But we cannot forget that we still need data. Even if we move to a completely remote sense monitoring system, we still need ground truth data to feed the models, run those systems. Particularly, it is not that simple. I'm talking, for example, when you measure, for example, carbon stocks, we are talking in measurements in depth. So far, our satellites cannot see below surface, for example. And yes, yet, maybe in future, we hope so. Everybody has Superman vision, right? But it's promising. Yeah, we are hoping for that.
In the spirit of healthy debate only. Yeah. Only healthy debate. I think, there are great strides have been made on that problem. So in forests, for example, again, this is industry standard to use remote sensing. You have this technology called LiDAR, which actually measures the tree height directly using lasers. One of Jim's, my favorite anecdotes of Jim's is that people used to ground truth their LiDAR measurements. Now they LiDAR truth their ground measurements. So you have that, but you don't have that everywhere. And you don't have that super often. So what people do is they use regular remote sensing, multispectral, to also quantify forest carbon stock. Really, with multispectral, you can only see the tops of the trees. You have no idea what's going on beneath, and yet it still works. And we see the same thing with soils, where we can derive properties that are at the surface only, but it's highly correlated to what's happening below.
Yeah, but we still need data ground data to do that.
We agree with that.
Yeah.
We need ground data. Anyone who says differently, don't trust him.
All right, we're going to conclude with one final question, and Spencer, it's coming to you. Can you give me even one example of a successful nature-based carbon program that actually generated credits that people believe in?
I mean, I mentioned about 5% of our 430-ish ratings are A or better, so I feel pretty good about all of those. There's plenty in the upper ends of the B that are pretty good. I will not name individual projects. Our ratings do move markets, and so I will not name them explicitly, but I can give you some examples. There are peatland projects in Indonesia, a blue carbon project in Madagascar. There's a soil project in the U.S. There's a avoided development project in Pennsylvania. There's a forest management project in Maine. All of those are in the upper echelons of our ratings. So yes, there are certainly examples of them. I think the news always focuses on the bad apples, and that's been really unfortunate for the market. There are plenty of good examples. That doesn't mean we don't have problems to fix, though.
Let's thank our panelists.